It is the voice of Indiana County, WCCS AM 1160, 101.1 FM. Indiana in the Morning is presented by First Commonwealth Bank. Joel Richard Paul is on the telephone with us. The book is called Without Precedent, Chief Justice John Marshall and His Times. Joel, good morning.
Good morning.
It's great to have you with us here today. It really is a tremendous story because we've got all of these wonderful stories of our founding fathers, and John Marshall is a name we come across in all of them. And he obviously has great significance in American history, but we know very little about him. Why is that?
Well, I think in some ways, John Marshall's success in deciding the case of Marbury versus Madison, which establishes the principle that the court can strike down laws as unconstitutional, that kind of eclipsed all of the other incredible achievements that Marshall had. For 6 decades, he was at the center of every important political event in the nation's history. He was at Valley Forge as an aide to George Washington. He distinguished himself in the Continental Army. He was an important diplomat, a leader of the Federalist Party in Virginia, a Secretary of State long before he became Chief Justice. And as Chief Justice, he was on the court for 34 years. He participated in more than 1,100 decisions. More than half of those he wrote himself personally, and all but 36 of them were unanimous. So he had just an incredible impact on what our nation has become. And I don't think anyone in the founding generation did more than he did to shape our country.
I marvel at the very fact that America even survived its founding because the model had never been tried before. The founders had to pretty much make it up as they went. Marshall was so much involved in it all, mixing it up with the other famous names. We look at the history books and we think, well, this is one just big happy family crafting together something in a room. It wasn't like that at all, was it?
No, it was not. Marshall was really the last of the great Federalists on the court. All of the members of the court who were appointed after him were appointed by Republican presidents who opposed Marshall's federalism. They all sought to try to reverse it, and Marshall, through his intellect and his charm, was always able to find common ground and forge a consensus on the court. He was also a second cousin to Thomas Jefferson, who was then president in 1801, and Jefferson was determined to destroy Marshall and to change the nature of the Supreme Court and make it dependent on the executive branch. And Marshall was constantly in a pitched battle with Jefferson and later with Andrew Jackson. So there was a great deal of politics and political division that were going on, but Marshall was a guy who believed in compromise and moderation and pragmatic solutions to problems.
We have read before in biographies of others of the founders how the communications were accomplished in that day, and many times it was through anonymous writings by people with made-up names. Marshall would do that. He would be involved in that sort of thing as well. The public debate was actually played out on the pages of newspapers and pamphlets of that sort that made their way around. I particularly enjoyed your account of one round between Madison and Marshall as they went back and forth. It was really pitched, wasn't it?
Right. It got very nasty, and it was sort of funny because these people, they knew each other personally. Marshall and Madison at one point were close friends and allies in the fight to ratify the Constitution in Virginia, a fight in which Jefferson never supported the Constitution, but Madison and Marshall were the two guys in Virginia who got the Virginia delegates to approve the Constitution. And yet they had this very bitter debate in public, but using made-up names. And the reason for that was to avoid a duel. You could say something that was very critical about your opponent when you used the name Pacificus, as they did, rather than using your own name. But you couldn't, if you used your own name and you said something very critical of them, you might find yourself facing a duel.
You named the book Without Precedent, and that's because the precedents were set many, many times by John Marshall on the court, his Supreme Court colleagues. Marshall's decisions made back in the 17 and early 1800s still ring here today in today's day and age. Why is he so important to us today?
Well, Marshall, when Marshall began writing on the court, we didn't have much in the way of precedents. The court had heard very few cases before Marshall and almost none of any significance. And so Marshall had to invent a lot of the law, and he had a great capacity for inventing the law because he had really kind of invented himself. He came up from very, very poor background, he came from a family with no education, and he learned to somehow reinvent himself, and he used that talent for reinvention also with regard to the law. Some of the important principles that Marshall established, for example, Marbury versus Madison, was the principle that the president and his aides could have their actions reviewed by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has the power not just to strike down acts of Congress, but also to question actions of the executive branch. As Chief Justice Marshall established the foundations of Indian law. He established the principle that international law is part of our law. He established the principle that the federal law is supreme over the states, and that there are rights to private property and to private corporations and private colleges. All of these things Marshall established that are important in our laws today.
And the exciting thing about it to me is the story of our founders often is written by men and in many cases women who had absolutely no formal education in order to come up with the heroic actions that they took as founders. It's just amazing to me.
It was amazing to me too. I mean, here's this guy who grows up in a family with 15 brothers and sisters in a 2-room log cabin on the frontiers of Virginia. His dad is a farmer. His mom teaches him how to read, and the only books his father could get a hold of were books he borrowed from one of his father's employers. So he brings home books for John Marshall to read at a very young age, like Blackstone's Commentaries on the Law, which is a book that I have to say I would have a hard time getting through myself. So, at a very young age, he's reading pretty sophisticated stuff. And he gets 1 year of grammar school education. That was it. And then he takes... after he gets out of the military, he had 6 weeks of legal training at the College of William and Mary, and the only reason he ends up there is because he's pursuing a young lady who happens to be living in Williamsburg, and the only excuse he can come up with for being in Williamsburg is going to take these law courses. So that was his education, and he was an exceptional writer, just brilliant writer, and great thinker, but he was really a self-made man.
It is a fascinating story. It's called Without Precedent, Chief Justice John Marshall and His Times, and the description that you give of Marshall's home life is a real eye-opener as well. Joel Richard Paul has been with us here this morning on Indiana in the Morning. What kind of reaction are you getting to the book?
Well, I've been blessed with wonderful acclaim from critics. The book has really been very well received by the critics, and I'm very grateful for that. And our book sales seem to be doing pretty well. So I'm not going to quit my day job yet, but I'm enjoying this run.
Does it become the next musical?
I hope the book has I hope the book that helps people to understand. Not just about the law, but really about a large chunk of American history, because, as I said, for 60 years, Marshall was at the center of everything that happened in our history, and I really wrote the book as a way to give people a kind of fun introduction to a lot of American history.
And who knows, maybe like Unlikely Allies, it becomes your next big musical. How about that?
Yes, my previous book, Unlikely Allies, which is the real story of how a merchant, a playwright, and a spy, I should say a cross-dressing spy, saved the American Revolution. That book is now a musical. So I'm very grateful.
Well, we appreciate your time with us here this morning. His name is Joel Richard Paul. The book is Without Precedent, Chief Justice John Marshall and His Times. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Our pleasure. Have a great day.